When you experience emotional neglect, what was done to you, you will unconsciously do to yourself. If your emotions were minimized, you will minimize your own emotions. If your feelings were judged, you'll judge them. If no one stayed with you in discomfort, you learn to leave yourself when things get hard. So emotional neglect often shows up as shaming yourself for where you are, telling yourself you should be over this by now, staying busy so you don't have to feel, numbing, pushing through things instead of slowing down, never checking in with your emotional well-being. And without realizing it, you leave that inner child and inner teen alone with their feelings. Welcome to Grow with Robin Breckenridge, a podcast about stepping into the most fully expressed, aligned, and conscious version of yourself. Here, we dive into the real work of personal growth, establishing boundaries, understanding your patterns, building self-trust, healing emotional wounds, and creating relationships that feel safe, authentic, and fulfilling. I'm Robin, a life and relationship coach, and in each episode, we'll explore the tools, insights, and conversations that will help you not just improve your life and relationships, but truly transform them. You don't have to just go through it. Let's grow through it, and let's do it together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're talking about something that I see the effects of every single day in my coaching. It's something that I struggled with myself in my own life, and often why I discounted my own internal experience because I would say things like, I don't understand. I didn't have big trauma. My parents are married. Nobody was an alcoholic. Like, what's wrong with me? So today we're going to talk about one of the most overlooked and most impactful experiences a person can have: emotional neglect. We often think of trauma as the things that happen to us, which it is. But emotional neglect is the trauma of what didn't happen. It's the absence of attunement, the absence of emotional presence, the absence of someone noticing, responding to, and staying connected with your inner world. It often looks like growing up in a home where your physical needs may have been met, but your emotional world was not consistently seen, understood, or held. And emotional neglect is especially hard to name because as a child, you don't have language for it. So it doesn't feel recognizable in childhood. It shows up later. It shows up in your relationships, what you tolerate, your boundaries, your self-worth, your patterns. And it stays embedded in your nervous system. So today in this episode, we're going to explore what emotional neglect actually is, why you don't need to have bad parents for it to occur or to have had what we would call a bad childhood, why emotional needs can't be met by emotionally immature parents, how emotional neglect gets internalized, how it impacts your nervous system and your relationships, the ache it leaves inside, and how healing begins. And you probably guessed it. It all begins with you through attunement, compassion, and aligned action. We're also going to talk about something that is so motivating. Trust me. I know how daunting this work can feel. I know how it can be like, oh my gosh, I thought I was getting this boundary thing down. Now I got to look at my emotional neglect. But the part that is so motivating for me, like there's a concept in education called rigor and relevance. What it means is that if you make something relevant to someone, they'll put the work in. So here's where I'm going to make it relevant for you guys to put the work in. Once you have awareness around emotional neglect, you stop doing it to yourself. And when you stop doing it to yourself, you stop doing it to other people. It gives you the power to stop the cycle of generational trauma with your own children, or even just in the space you hold for others. My hope is that this episode gives language to places inside you that may have never had it before. So let's get into it. Emotional neglect is when your emotional world is not consistently met, seen, understood, or cared for. It's not always dramatic. It's not always visible. It's not always yelling, violence, chaos. In fact, emotional neglect often happens in homes that looked totally fine from the outside. It sounds like no one noticing you when you were sad, no one checking in after something painful happened, no one asking how you felt, no one comforting you when you were scared, no one comforting you when you were sad or in a challenging emotion, no one repairing after conflict, no one guiding you through your emotional experiences, no one modeling emotional presence or curiosity, and no one having or allowing healthy boundaries. It can sound like, you're fine. It's not a big deal. Stop being so sensitive. Get over it. And my least favorite saying I think I've ever heard in my entire life: children are to be seen and not heard. Ugh, I cringe even saying it. So keep this in mind. Children can't say, we don't have the ability to say, you know what, my parents aren't meeting my emotional needs. Instead, they think, there's something wrong with me. I'm too much. I shouldn't feel this way. My needs don't matter. Or I have to handle things on my own. Emotional neglect becomes woven into your relationships, and it becomes the air you breathe, invisible, unnamed, and deeply shaping. You did not need to have abusive, cruel, or chaotic parents to have experienced emotional neglect. Now, keep in mind, I will probably venture to say that if any of those things happen to you, you are also experiencing emotional neglect. But you don't have to experience those things to experience emotional neglect. Many people grew up in homes that were stable, hardworking, respectful, well-intentioned, and even loving, and still experienced emotional neglect. Our parents' parents were raising children in a very different emotional world. They weren't taught emotional literacy. They didn't grow up talking about their feelings. I grew up with Oprah on TV. Dr. Phil had a show. We have social media. My social media, just saying, because this is a possibility for people, is a very healthy space. I only follow accounts that I learn something from or are affirming and supportive. Everything on my social media page is something to do with emotional growth and being the best version of me. There are so many things that I get just from going on social media that help me with my mental health. But our parents, they didn't grow up talking about their feelings. They didn't have these things on TV. And if you did go to therapy, which most people didn't, you didn't tell anybody because it was a very shameful thing. So we have to keep in mind that I'm not here to dog everybody's parents. Everybody is doing the best they can with the tools and awareness they have at the time. But if your parents and your parents' parents were not attuned to, then they don't know how to emotionally attune to themselves. So emotional neglect is inherited. It's not always intentional. So this is definitely not about vilifying your parents, but it is about naming the things that impacted us so that you can stop turning this inward and believing that it was your fault. Now, I know I've told this story before on the podcast, but it's worth mentioning again. the story about the kid that was crying in my kindergarten class, and I couldn't get him to stop crying. And finally I got down on his level and I said, hey, buddy, if you don't tell me what's wrong, I can't help you. So if we just breeze over these things, how are we going to accurately attune to these parts of self that has experienced something that negatively impact their well-being? That's why it's really important to talk about and name emotional neglect. So, like I said earlier, we cannot get our emotional needs met by emotionally immature people. In our case, growing up, most likely it was our parents. Even if they love us, even if they meant well, emotional immaturity means someone lacks the capacity to sit with emotional discomfort, manage and tolerate their own emotions, repair ruptures that happen in the relationship in a healthy way, being emotionally accountable. And often emotionally immature parents need you to be okay so they can feel okay. This is where so much codependency begins. The quiet belief, if you're okay, I'm okay. Instead of learning, how do I be with someone who's in a challenging emotional experience? Because I don't know a single human who's going to get past that one. We all have feelings. This life absolutely at some point hands each and every one of us our ass in some type of way. We can't have everybody be okay all the time. So instead of learning how do I feel and what do I need while I'm experiencing this feeling, we learn how do I manage the emotional environment. So remember, healing often means grieving what you didn't get and stopping the search for attunement or to be seen, heard, loved, etc., where it is not available. So emotional attunement is the ability to notice, respond to, and stay present with another person's emotional experience. Attunement sounds like, that makes sense. I see you. I hear you. I'm right here with you. It's okay to be where you are. You don't have to go through this alone. Attunement doesn't fix or rush. Sometimes it's simply being with someone in a feeling. I have a special sign right across from where I'm sitting on my wall in my office that says, just be with. Because I have a job where people pay me to come up with solutions. Well, guess what? Sometimes I don't have solution. One, I'm human. Two, sometimes things happen in life that are just awful. I've had people call me and say, Robin, my mom died last week, or find out that the person they're in love with that they've been working, doing all of this great work with has been unfaithful. I mean, there's just things that happen that are awful, and there's not a formula to get everybody out of feelings all the time or for them to feel better. So that sign is a reminder to me that often the most profound thing I can do, even when I'm being paid to fix and solve people's problems, is to just be with them and to just hold space for their emotional experience. Now, where this gets a little complicated is to be able to sit with someone else's discomfort, you have to know how to sit with your own. And guess what? That's why every single person listening to this episode today, it's why you're here. You are learning attunement, and we're starting with yourself first. Let's get to the pattern part. When no one consistently attends to your emotional world as a child, your nervous system adapts. You learn to disconnect from your feelings, suppress your needs, minimize your pain, hyper attune to other people's emotional experiences. Just get through it alone, isolate, never expect repair from anyone, become hyper independent, tolerate feeling out of alignment, stay quiet to stay connected. Those are just some of the patterns that go along with emotional neglect. There's a well-known study on attachment where infants whose cries weren't responded to eventually stopped crying. Where infants who were left to cry it out were studied, and some of them eventually just stopped crying. Now, they didn't stop crying because they self-regulated, because babies cannot self-regulate. Babies need to co-regulate. But they stopped crying because they knew no one was coming. I couldn't even tell that story without my eyes filling up with tears because it's so sad. That is often what happened to a lot of us, is we figured out in some way. Now, it might not have been that you were crying in your crib, but somewhere, either our feelings were shameful, we didn't want to bring them to anyone, or we knew no one was going to come. So keep in mind that baby did not regulate. That baby resigned. So what happens to us when we know no one's coming in those really scary emotional experiences? We become the strong one. And underneath that strength is a child who knew nobody was coming. Now, let me be clear. No human can meet every need of another human. So if there's any parents listening going, oh no, I am messing up my kid, I am well aware that as we speak, there are probably things that I'm not attuning to in my own child. But I want to make sure, because I believe my job in parenting my son is to keep him emotionally and physically safe. I now have a 15-year-old boy who often has a mom who checks in with how he's feeling. So we can't meet every need, but most of us don't know how to meet or attune basically to other people or ourselves. So when a child is repeatedly left alone with emotional pain, it leaves a mark. And without attunement, you adapt. You cope through some of the patterns you've heard on this podcast: overfunctioning, caretaking, perfectionism, focusing on being productive, intellectualizing our feelings, numbing, staying busy, staying needed, etc., 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 etc. Now, remember, those patterns helped you survive. But over time, they impact our ability to be in healthy connection. So here's something so important to remember. When you experience emotional neglect, what was done to you, you will unconsciously do to yourself. If your emotions were minimized, you will minimize your own emotions. If your feelings were judged, you'll judge them. If no one stayed with you in discomfort, you learn to leave yourself when things get hard. So emotional neglect often shows up as shaming yourself for where you are, telling yourself you should be over this by now, staying busy so you don't have to feel, numbing, pushing through things instead of slowing down, never checking in with your emotional well-being. And without realizing it, you leave that inner child and inner teen alone with their feelings, just like they were left before. So even though your physical environment looks so much different than the environment you grew up in, the internal world is very much the same and still full of a lot of emotional neglect. Emotional neglect does not stay in our childhood. It repeats. So you may find yourself choosing emotionally unavailable partners, carrying the emotional or financial load in your relationships, doing a lot of the emotional labor, being the quote unquote strong one, holding everything while no one holds you. And that's just your nervous system choosing what's familiar. So let's talk about healing emotional neglect, because that's what we're here to do. We're here to build awareness, identify, heal, and what is such a huge part of healing, taking your power back now. So healing emotional neglect isn't about blaming anyone. It's about turning towards the parts of you that were left alone. Healing looks like naming the experience, validating the impact, holding space for the way that you feel, the sadness, the grief, the anger, just being with yourself in those emotions, identifying your unmet needs, practicing receiving, which I know for so many of us is so hard. In fact, I'm probably going to do an episode one of these days just on practicing receiving. Choosing alignment over familiarity. And finally, becoming the emotionally attuned inner parent you always needed. Now you have a conscious adult. That means you can speak kindly to yourself. You can protect yourself by setting boundaries. You can ask for support. You can start to slow down the motor of overfunctioning. And you can start to emotionally attune to yourself. And trust me, if I can do it, anybody can do it. Emotional neglect is a quiet wound, but it deeply impacts your nervous system. Healing and doing this type of work is not about doing it perfectly. It's about being more present. It's about staying with yourself instead of leaving when hard feelings show up. So here's your invitation. Short and simple. When a feeling arises, pause. Try speaking kindly to yourself. And try asking yourself this question. Instead of getting out of the feeling, and try this. Instead of what most of our default responses will do, our default responses will be like, get out of this feeling. That's how we manage this feeling, right? But we realize now that if you continue to get out of the feeling, it's going to keep knocking, and it's going to knock louder and louder because the feelings are carrying a need. Your nervous system is never going to stop trying to get you back into alignment. So if we know if you get out of the feeling, you're just going to end up back in it, and we're going to have to run, and we're going to have to run faster and faster and try to outrun it. Now, I'm just telling you, I've been doing this for 10 years, again, working on myself even longer. I've never seen anyone outrun a feeling. I don't think it's possible. So instead of trying to get out of it, what I want you to do is ask yourself this question. How do I take care of myself while I feel like this? That is your first step towards emotional attunement. Also, I know a lot of you guys have been listening to the podcast each week, so you know some of the tools that I've already mentioned on the podcast. AVPS, which I mentioned on other episodes, is one of my absolute favorite tools for emotional attunement. You can use it to attune to yourself, to parts of yourself. You can use it to attune to other people. Remember, these tools are not to escape the feeling, but to support yourself while you're experiencing it. You don't need to get out of the emotion. Remember, the emotion is just communicating a need. So you don't need to get out of the emotion. You do need to stay with yourself through it. That is how we break cycles of generational trauma. I'm so glad you're here. You are supposed to be here. We are supposed to be doing this work. I'll see you next time. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for being here and for doing this work. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Come connect with me over on TikTok at Robin Breckenridge, or Instagram at Coach with Robin, where I share even more insights, tools, and conversations around boundaries, self-trust, relational healing, and so much more. And just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational and personal growth purposes only. The insights and tools I share are based on my experience as a life and relationship coach and are meant for general guidance. Each person's story is unique, and the nuances of individual experiences can't always be addressed in this format. What's shared here may not be applicable to every situation, especially those involving abuse, oppression, severe mental illness, or systematic harm. If you or someone you know is in crisis, please seek support from a qualified mental health professional or emergency resources. Thank you for listening and for showing up for yourself in this way. Take care, and I'll see you next time.